This is Confronting Christianity. We took about 2 weeks off because of 10 days of prayer. And so for the Confronting Christianity, we have tonight, and then we have next week, Thursday. And then after that, we'll be pretty much done with this whole series. So the purpose of this series is just to discuss some hard questions that people ask Christians all the time. And just see what answers we can find. Answers from the Bible, answers from reason, answers from philosophy, theology, and just different sources to kind of tackle some of these things. So anyway, we dealt with a lot of it so far. We've dealt with religion. Is religion a force for good or evil? We've dealt with how can we only say there's one true faith. We've also dealt with the Bible condoning quote-unquote bad practices. And so tonight, I want to deal with another topic, and I'll kick it off with a statement that Steve Jobs, a story about Steve Jobs. I think we all know who Steve Jobs is, former founder, co-founder, and former CEO of Apple Inc. And it said that there was one time where Steve's adopted parents, didn't grow up with his real parents, but Steve's adopted parents used to take him to a Lutheran church. And one day they took him to the church, and he went up to the pastor. And I think he had a newspaper or a magazine in his hand, and it was a newspaper or a magazine of starving children. And he went to the pastor, and he said, "Does God have the ability to prevent these kids from starving?" And the pastor said, "Yeah, he does." He said, "So why doesn't he do so?" And the pastor said, "Steve, it is what it is." And Steve looked at him and said, "Well, if that's the kind of God that's promoted here in this church, I don't want to have anything to do with church." And from the age 5 going, he never stepped foot in a church again in order to engage in worship. This brings up the confronting Christianity question that we're all going to talk about today. And it's this one. If God is all good and all powerful, then why does he allow suffering? That is the question. So theologians will call this the problem of evil. And here's why it's a problem. It's a problem because they will say, well, Christians say God is all good. Well, if God is all good, then why is he allowing suffering? Okay, well, if God allows suffering, then maybe he's not really that good. Or if he allows suffering, then maybe he's not really that powerful. Or people would say, if suffering took God by surprise, then God is not really all-knowing. Either way you spin this, suffering is here. And if suffering is here, it either means God is not good, God is not powerful, or if it took God by surprise, then he's not all-knowing. Either way, then he can't really be God. And you Christians are just worshiping a fairy tale. If this question comes to you, how do you deal with it? It's our questions. This is the hardest one. Okay. I'm a devil advocate. I don't know why we always say devil's advocate. They say the devil don't need an advocate, but whatever. I'll devil's advocate you, and I thought you, I thought you was recording it. Yeah. Oh, I thought you had someone on FaceTime or something. All right. Anyway, what was I about to say to you? Yes, Gary. So here's a rebuttal. Rebuttal will go as follows. Well, if Satan comes into the picture, God obviously, this is God's omniscience. God is all-knowing, to predict what comes in the future. Didn't he know that a devil would be coming and that the devil will inflict suffering? If he knew then why didn't he stop him? If he didn't know, he can't really be all knowing. What's your response? Oh, that was but it was a good explanation. And hopefully today, what I can do is take some of what everybody has talked about and put it in a hopefully what would be a simple way to remember it or a simple way to be able to explain it. And so, anyway, thank you all for your responses. And why don't we get into things just a little bit? So, the first thing I want to say about this topic is I really like this diagram because this diagram shatters our ego and makes us all humble. It says what we know we don't know, and what we don't know that we don't know. And as you can clearly see, what we know pales in comparison to what we know we don't know and what we don't even know that we know. So concerning this topic, Yes, there is some that we do know, but there's so much more that we know we don't know. And there's so much that we don't even know that we don't know. And so this is what the Bible calls a mystery, and some things are mysteries. But then I think you guys have seen that text before. Let me see. Deuteronomy 29. Get a Bible out here. Maybe someone could help me with that. Deuteronomy 29. It's 29. Yep, 29. Deuteronomy 29. If anybody has it, they can take us away. Yeah, powerful statement, right? So there are some things which are secret, and those belong to God. But then there are some things which He has revealed to us, and those belong to us. And so we can work with what He's revealed, and what He has not revealed, we just trust Him with it. All right. So I must admit, this is not original to me. I borrowed it. as I do 90% of my things. And I thought that this was a pretty neat way to understand the problem of evil and the problem of suffering. And it's something that you can also use to help you kind of organize all the information together. And at the same time, if you ever were in a position where you had the opportunity to explain it to a sincere seeker, then you could be able to share this with them. The story moves as follows. I could have added pre-creation, but I'm just going to lump that into creation. Creation, the story of suffering goes in 6 moves: creation, fall, covenant, Christ, church, and recreation. I hope that's making sense so far. So in 6 moves, we see the story of God and suffering. I'll note again: creation, fall, covenant, Christ, church, and recreation. Any thought, comment, question on that before I move forward? All right, sounds good. So the first thing we want to do is look at creation. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 31, there's a statement that's made by the time God finishes making the entire world. It says, God looked, and behold, He saw that it was very good. Now, this statement is so foundational because, well, let me back it up. This statement is so foundational because it establishes the fact, similar to what you just said, Robert, that when God originally creates this world, His original plan and His original design is 100% good, free from evil, free from pain, free from death, and free from suffering. In other words, this right here is God's ideal vision of what He wants for humanity. And I think that it's very important to always establish this, that what God always wants for humans is what's going to be absolutely positive for them. And that everything that takes place post this time is His attempt to get it back to this time. I hope that makes sense to everybody. That first and foremost, what God makes is good. But the second thing we also find in creation is Genesis 1:26. I'm just trying to take it as slowly as possible. And in Genesis 1:26, we find that out of love, God makes humans, He makes humans with the ability to make free choices. So this is what theologians call the love freedom paradigm. I don't have it on the screen, so I'm just going to explain it in 4 steps. The first idea is that if you're going to have love, it's 4 things. You're going to have love. Love necessitates freedom. Love necessitates freedom because freedom teaches responsibility. Responsibility is critical because responsibility produces growth. Love necessitates freedom. Freedom, if freedom is used properly, is supposed to necessitate or build responsibility, and responsibility, properly managed, helps to build growth. And this is God's 4 steps in creating us. He loves us. In love, he gives us freedom to make choices. The freedom is supposed to help us to be responsible, and the responsibility is supposed to help us grow. But the problem is that when you have love, and you give freedom, freedom also involves another R word. It involves risk. That takes us to our next step over here. It takes us to our fall. So Genesis 3 verse 6 describes our fall. We could probably turn there so that we could look at that ourselves together. Genesis 3 verse 6. If anybody has that, they can help me with it. This was the beginning of the end. And now let's work on it. Let's work on Genesis 3. So the first thing I would like to show us in Genesis 3 are the consequences that emerged due to the fall. So if someone can read Genesis 3 verse 8. So Bill, notice what you just read. Adam and Eve have sinned, and now they are hiding from God. So theologians will say this was the start of our spiritual problems. They were hiding from God, or from our spiritual suffering. They were hiding from God. Now, notice the next one. Can you read verses 9 and verses 10? Okay, so notice what he's saying here. Remember, nakedness is connected with shame. How do we know that? Genesis 2, verse 25. Can you read that one there? We're going through a lot of Bible. Yes, Robert. You believe they had babies in the garden? Your childbearing. Or your travail. Okay, that's an interesting theory. What I would say is that if they did have kids in the garden, the only challenge with that is, that was number one. They would have had access to the fruit. That would be the question. The question would be, then would they be as culpable of sin because of not being able to eat the fruit? Okay. Well, something to think about. Go ahead for us, Bill. Genesis 2:25. Okay, perfect. So they were both naked, the man and his wife, and they were not ashamed. So now take it back to Genesis 3, verse 8. I'm sorry, Genesis 3, verse 10. It says, I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked. So, in other words, now he's afraid because he is naked because shame has been introduced in the picture. So, in Genesis 3, verse 8, they are hiding. That's the start of our spiritual problems. Genesis 3, verse 10, there is shame. That's the start of our psychological problems. Yes. Mm, 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 mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm. Conviction, exactly, exactly. And you see, and even to go deeper with what Calvin is saying, see, condemnation is linked to shame. Conviction is linked to guilt. Let me explain. Because shame is where you feel bad because of your identity. I am wrong. That's what shame is. And that's what the devil tries to do. I am wrong. You are wrong. Guilt is where it's focused on behavior. Your behavior, what you did was wrong. When the Holy Spirit convicts, he's trying to show what we're doing or how we're thinking to lead how we're doing is wrong. Therefore, we can engage in repentance. But when the devil comes to condemn, he tries to link it to our identities. Who you are is wrong. But when the Holy Spirit convicts us of what we do, he still reminds us of who we are. We're his child. We're his daughter. We're a prince. We're a king. We're a masterpiece. That doesn't change. So his conviction is focused on our thought patterns that led to certain behaviors. The devil's condemnation is trying to attack our identities. Very key difference over there. Okay, Bill, if you could keep helping me out. Now, can you read verse 11 and 12? Yep. Okay. So here we see blaming, right? Adam feels like he's about to get the axe for sinning. So he's like, hold up, buddy. It's really hurt, right? So, okay, watch what I've shown so far. In 3 verse 8, they are hiding from God. It's the start of our spiritual problems. In 3 verse 10, he is ashamed for being naked. It's the start of our psychological suffering or our psychological problems. In 3 verse 12, he's blaming the woman. It's the start of our sociological or our social problems. All happening all right here in Genesis chapter 3. You've got spiritual suffering, you've got psychological suffering, you've got social suffering, all happening right in front of us. All right, let's finish it up. So take me now to verse 17, Bill. Yeah, go ahead with verse 18 too. So now they were hiding, start of our spiritual problems. They were ashamed, start of our psychological problems. There was blame, start of our social problems. And the ground was cursed. It was the start of our ecological problems. You find all suffering flowing from the one decision to rebel against God. Our social, our spiritual, our psychological, our social, and our ecological suffering starts from there. I want to pause. Any question, thought, comment, concern? Do we see it all there? Good question. Or what do you all think? I have some reasons. What do you all think? Why does the ground get cursed for his sake? Well, let's connect it straight to Genesis 2. In Genesis 2, the task he's given is to till and to keep the garden, or kill and to keep the ground. And so therefore, his hardship, if you actually let's take it back to Genesis 1. If you go to Genesis 1, you realize that the humans were given 2 commands. The first command was to be fruitful and to multiply. The second one was to have dominion over the earth. If you notice that in the curses, both privileges that were given to the humans get frustrated. And so increasing and multiplying becomes more difficult because now the pregnancy becomes difficult on the woman's side. That's her curse. And then the dominion over the earth becomes frustrated because now the ground has been cursed, meaning that the man has to work harder in order to ensure that he kind of controls and cultivates the ground. And so in a sense, it's almost like the message behind the curse is that now what sin and suffering has done is that it has frustrated God's original purpose for us. Very interesting dynamic. All right. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Ultimately, yeah. Not immediately, though. Nobody likes sweating. All right. So this is the fall. And in this fall, this is where sin emerges and suffering. It is why I always say suffering comes as a byproduct of sin. And we saw 4 levels of suffering: spiritual suffering, psychological suffering, social suffering, ecological suffering. And we see examples of all of those. Spiritual suffering, people running and hiding from God, people creating lies about God, people killing in the name of God. Psychological suffering, all the type of mental battles that we all go through. Social suffering from all the isms, from racisms to war to tribalism to ethnocentrism, all of that. From ecological suffering, disasters, right? Matter of fact, I'll even add this. It's so interesting. You read a book called Patriarchs and Prophets. It's by a lady called Ellen White. She actually says that prior to sin, we didn't have the seasons, the cold weather, the real cold, the real hot. We didn't have all of that. It was actually very pleasant and balanced. But in bringing that set of suffering, it threw off the ecology as well. Matter of fact, actually, let me show you a text about this. Why don't you go to Romans 8? Go to Romans 8. It actually talks about how the earth is suffering. 8:9. No, it's probably 8:24, 23. Oh, does it? Romans 8, verse 9? Let me see. Well, we're going there. Might as well look at it. Romans 8:9 says, "But you are not in the flesh, but in the spirit, if indeed the Spirit of God dwells in you. Now, if anyone does not have the Spirit of Christ, he is not his." All right. No, you're good. Can someone read Romans 8:22? A very interesting text. Many people don't read. Yeah. Isn't that a very interesting statement? The whole creation groans and labors with pain together until now. Now, when it says the whole creation, it's not only referring to the whole creation in terms of creatures, human beings, it's also referring to the whole creation, the ecology, the geography of the world, even groans and labors with pain until now, right? And so we've got 4 levels of suffering that we see with the fall. So let's finish. We've got creation, then we've got the fall. But then we've also now got, well, let me just go on with this. But then Revelation 12:7 adds some details to the fall. So why don't we go to Revelation 12, verse 7. Huh? Oh, Romans 8:19. Yeah, for the present sufferings of this time are not compared. Yep. Yes. Exactly. So let's look at Revelation 12:7, everybody. We've got 12:7 to 9. Anybody can read from verses 7 to 9, and it adds additional details about the fall. Anybody could read that. Anybody? Keep going to 9. Oh, Bill, you got it? All right, so we get additional details that serpent we see in the garden is not just an animal, but there's a malevolent spirit behind it that was tricking our first parents, called the devil. And this complicates the problem of suffering. All right, so moving forward. So now we have the covenant. We have creation. Everything is good, and this is foundational because creation says that God made everything good. The fall is pivotal because it shows that while we have freedom, we misused our freedom, we were irresponsible, and instead of it leading to our growth, it led to our detriment. Those were our 4 problems: spiritual, psychological, social, ecological, right? So that was the fall. But then it goes bigger than that because the spirit behind the fall is the old dragon, the serpent, the devil, who inflicts suffering on people. That's where that comes in. But then now we have the covenant, right? And these are things that we know, but I'm just trying to put it in a sequence, in a framework for us so that it can help us fit all the details in there and makes it easy to explain to others. But now you have the covenant. And we have, a lot of people think that there's only like old covenant and new covenant, and it's like, that's not true. There's like 1,000 covenants in the Bible. It's all kind of covenants. But here, I'm about to give everybody the big, major covenants, all right? Major covenant number 1. That is a great point, Cap. Covenant is, I'm going to keep it as simple as possible. Covenant is an agreement, like a contract between 2 people, or not even 2 people, but whichever parties are going to be involved. So it's just like a contract. Say we're about to do something together. Here are the terms of the agreement. Sandy, do you sign off? Robert, do you sign off? Then we're going to behave in accordance to the contract, right? And if there are breaches to the contract, there are consequences, right? That's how it works. And the same way a covenant works too, right? We got all kinds of covenants. So you say you can't, but here's the thing though. What do we call? Well, exactly. It's called, but let's talk about that. It's actually very interesting. I wish I could do a whole study on it. Do you know that a lot of times in the Old Testament, when the prophets were addressing the Israelites, they were actually bringing a covenant lawsuit to them? That's what it actually was. And it's actually structured like a covenant lawsuit. It's very interesting. And so you hear it all the time. They'll say, Israel, this is what God did for you. He did boom, 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 boom. This is what you were supposed to do. Be obedient, boom, 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 boom. But here's what you've done. You have broken the covenant. Boom, 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 boom. Right? That's exactly what it is. It's a suit that he's bringing. So because you've broken the covenant, here are the consequences. The Babylonians will destroy you. The Assyrians will destroy you. Boom, 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 boom. But then he gives them, and this is why God becomes a gracious God. Because technically, according to the covenant, the consequences are supposed to experience, and that's it. But notice God always gave them out. They said, but if you repent, boom, 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 I will do this. I will come back and I will help you. I will come back and I will heal you. You see, that's where we end up saying God is so merciful and he's so gracious, because despite the covenant, and if we break it, he still gives us a way to come back into that covenant relationship. I mean, it's just so beautiful. I can't even get into it. It's just so amazing. But yes, that's a covenant lawsuit, right? And we see that all the time in the Old Testament. And then going back to what you said, we can't sue God. Why can't we? But it's a good point you're making, Robert. Why can't we sue God? Because God always keeps his side of the covenant. It'll be thrown out. It'll be thrown out. Because he always keeps his end. He has never broken his side of the covenant, ever, right? It's just so beautiful. It's so beautiful. Anyway, yeah, go ahead. Yeah. No, it's true. Absolutely. Let me pause right here. I don't want to, we only have 15 minutes, but I'm almost done. Any questions? Anything anybody wants to say? Hope it's all making sense for you. We got creation, we got fall. Oh my goodness. Is my battery die? Yeah. Well, I do not have my charger. So that means I gotta move faster. All right, so covenant. So covenant pretty much says, okay, I'll survive. It's 10%. So what is God doing with the covenants? What God is doing with the covenants are two critical things. The first thing he's trying to do with all the agreements is that he's trying to mitigate the effects of suffering on us. How is he trying to do that? By giving us his laws and commands, so that by following his laws and commands, it can help reduce some of the suffering that we are exposed to in this world. Okay, let me give you one example. We always use this like for health, but it's bigger than health. Why don't we go to Exodus 15? If we can go to Exodus 15, I want to give one example, because this is one of the major covenants called the Sinaitic covenant. Exodus 15. Right here, yes. Exodus 15, verse 26. So the goal of the covenant is to help mitigate the effects of the suffering on creatures or on humans. Exodus 15, verse 26. If someone can go there for us, please. This summarizes one of the reasons he gave the covenant in relationship to sin and suffering. Okay, right? So he is saying, if you keep your end of the bargain, that's the contract, right? You keep the laws, you keep the commandments, you keep the statutes, I will hold my end of the bargain and mitigate the diseases that you could have experienced, but instead you won't experience them, because I am the Lord who heals you. Again, by keeping the covenant, it mitigates the suffering. Okay, go to Deuteronomy chapter 5. It's very interesting stuff. The covenant helps to mitigate the suffering. Deuteronomy 5. Deuteronomy 5. Verse, where is it? Okay, verse 29. Deuteronomy 5, verse 29. Someone can read that for us, please. All right, I'm going to underscore the last phrase, Bill, that it might be well with them and their children forever, right? Again, if you keep your side of the covenant, oh, that they would fear me and always keep my commandments, that it might be well with them and their children forever. So again, the covenants weren't intended to eliminate the suffering. They were just intended to mitigate effects of suffering on God's people by God's people keeping his commandments. Is this making sense to everybody? So I was supposed to give you all the covenants. Here's the first one. The first one is the covenant with Noah. We call it the Noah. Let me give you the Noahic covenant. The Noahic covenant. So that's the first one. The first one is a covenant with Noah, right? God makes a covenant with Noah that he won't destroy the world by water again. And he gives, what does he give us? A covenant always? Here on earth, if we're ratifying a contract, how do we all do it? You sign signature, you sign it. Okay. So God always has a way to sign his covenants. How does he sign that covenant with Noah? That he won't destroy? Rainbow, boom, period. Good, excellent. Man, you're on it, man, Robert. So then after that, God makes a covenant, and he makes it with who's the next big guy? Does anybody know? This is like the big covenant of covenants that cover all other covenants in the Bible. Huh? Nah, you're close, but that is a guy before Moses. The big one. The big chief. The Moses covenant is only relevant because of this guy's covenant. Yeah, you got it. Abraham. You got it. Spot on. You got Abraham. So you've got the Abraham covenant. And where God says, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to give you many children, right? You got that big covenant. Then after that Abraham covenant, you've got the covenant with Moses or the children of Israel, right? So you've got that covenant. And after you got that covenant, your next big covenant is the covenant with David. That's the huge covenant. That's where he says, David, I'm going to make sure you have an everlasting throne, right? You got that covenant. Here's the big point I want to make. All three big covenants with Abraham, with Noah, with Abraham, with Israel, with David. My question to you is that did we hold up our end of the bargain on each end? Not at all. Not at all. Not at all. And so, unfortunately, it didn't work with the covenants because we still experienced suffering. And this necessitated the Christ. This necessitates the Christ, right? So, as it relates to suffering, Christ takes on suffering to himself, right? He dies on a cross in order to put an end to suffering or an end to sin and suffering one day, right? Not immediately, but definitely one day. So anyway, these are some texts that we could talk about with the Christ. So let's go to 1 John 3, verse 8. 1 John chapter 3, verse 8. Anybody who has that can read it. That he might destroy the works of the devil. What is one of the works of the devil? Suffering. Christ comes to help eliminate the devil who brought suffering. Perfect. We're going to skip Ephesians 2, 8 through 10. We'll go to 1 Corinthians 15, 57. This is the most decisive one. Well, what Christ's death does on the cross and suffering. 1 Corinthians 15, 5 to 57. So when we look at that one. Okay, so what version is that one, Ed? New King James. All right, perfect. So if you go to some other versions, it actually it gets a little bit more explicit. It says, thanks be to God who gives us the victory over sin and death through our Lord Jesus Christ, right? So that's what Jesus' death does on the cross for us. It puts a significant blow to sin and suffering. I think the best way that people have explained this is in World War II terms. World War II terms. D-Day and V-Day. I think everybody kind of knows that, right? And D-Day was the big attack on Normandy Beach, right? And they say that that was let me make sure I'm getting it right. You had the Allied forces, you had the Axis forces, right? And the Allied forces land on that beach. And they have that huge invasion on Normandy. And D-Day significantly turns around the tide of the war, right? But the war is not officially over until about 2 years later on V-Day or Victory Day. And that's exactly what Christ's death on the cross is, right? It was a D-Day. It's where it turned the tide forever, right? But then, Siri, I'm not talking to you. Why there? Okay, so that's the Christ. The Christ has put a decisive blow to suffering. But then it's so beautiful because and here's the point I really wanted to reach tonight. The church has a role in suffering. The church has a role in suffering. Remember, the covenant was given to help mitigate suffering. Remember that? It didn't fully work, so Christ comes and he puts the decisive blow to sin and suffering. Suffering is not gone yet, but his death anticipates the end of suffering one day. Thank God for that. But then the church has a powerful role to play when it comes to suffering. And I want us all to read that together. It's Matthew 25, 31 through 40. The church has a role to play. So you see, suffering is a big concept. The church has a big role to play when it comes to suffering. Matthew 25, verse 31 to 40. Maybe anybody has it? Go ahead. And here it is. Mm, 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 mm. Wow. 3 minutes. Wow. Mm, 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 mm. Exactly. Exactly. What impresses me the most about it in relationship to our discussion as well is that in the context of suffering, it's so powerful because in between Christ and the recreation, the church is a remedial agent to mitigate the effects of suffering in this world. That's what the church is here for. That's one of the biggest reasons why the church is here. The church is here. The church experiences suffering because they get persecuted because of Jesus. But this church is an agent in order to mitigate suffering. We're feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, visiting the prisoners, healing the sick. That's all suffering mitigation measures that God has put the church in place in order to help out with. So suffering, the story of suffering starts with creation. God is not responsible for suffering because God creates a good world. The fall comes along, and the fall brings suffering, and it brings 4 levels of suffering: spiritual, psychological, social, and ecological suffering. The covenants are given to mitigate the personal effects of suffering, not just on individuals, but on communities by keeping God's laws. But we fail the covenant, and so the Christ comes to put a decisive blow to suffering, to give us all hope that suffering is not going to be around forever. As we wait for the Christ to return, the church stands as an intermediary agent to help mitigate the effects of suffering. But then it's beautiful because this ultimately tells us God's heart. We have the recreation. And in the recreation, he says, I heard aloud, my favorite text. I think I quote this every month when I preach. I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, look, God's dwelling place is now among the people. He will dwell with them. They will be his God, be his people. God himself will be their God. And my favorite part, and this is the end of suffering. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things have passed away. My laptop has died right at 7:30. I am